Morning. Okay, so just a very quick recap of what I ended up doing last time and the results of which we can now see today. So these are the two tank tops for the aft section, and these have now got 3 coats on the underside, and the tanks have got 3 coats on the inside, so these can now be glued in place on top of the tanks. And then the edges can be rounded and they can be taped in place. So that's 2 of those to go. But before we can do that, I'd just like to finish off the ports, tidy them up a little bit. So it was very difficult to cut perfectly round holes, and rather than kind of epoxy these into position, I'd like these to fit quite snug so that they can be removed, and I'd actually like to screw them in place on top of the paint, so the paint will create a seal, not epoxy, which means that they can be removed and replaced if necessary, because if I epoxy them in place, I'm effectively going to have to break the wood to get them out. So to do that, I need to create a nice seal, so I need to create a nice circle. So I'm trying to backfill where the wood isn't probably quite round enough, and I tried that using one of these ring frames and put that in place, and I covered it in white tape, and as you can see here it's covered in white tape to stop it from sticking, and I epoxied around that, but it was difficult to get out because although the epoxy didn't stick to the tape, there was a lot of friction, and getting it out was quite difficult, not to be repeated basically. So what I've done instead is I've created a cardboard circle just by cutting a piece of cardboard slightly bigger than the depth of the frame and joining that together around the circumference of the part that goes into the wood, and then covering that with tape, and then I can put that in and epoxy around it, and then once the epoxy started to cure I can just pull the frame out, and if this paper gets stuck for any reason I can just peel it off because it's card. So that should come off, and I can sand off any residue, etc, etc. So I would like to get that finished before I actually put the tank tops on, because I need to get access to the inside to do that. So that's the job for today. So what else? I also epoxied the mast collar. That's the mast collar. That's got 3 coats on the underside and the sides, and then this is the foredeck. So this has also got 3 coats of epoxy on the underside. So they still bear on top, because that will get sanded and painted later, sanded and epoxied later. But for now, these 2 would be ready to go and cover up the forward tank with the mast, the hole cut for the mast, which is good, which is 2.5 inches for the laser mast. So I could potentially put the mast collar in place, but first I'd like to again backfill that porthole as well. So 3 portholes really need to be backfilled before I can finish off these tanks. But otherwise the tanks are done. You know, they've got 3 coats of epoxy on the inside, so that's going to be waterproof. So they just really need these portholes finishing off. The daggerboard case had 3 coats on the inside as well. I did that on the floor, and I kind of walked around quite a lot, and I think I stirred up some dust because it's got some little sprinkles of dust which have stuck to the surface, but you're not going to be able to see that. But in order to not cause it to make the daggerboard stick as it's trying to go through here, I've just sanded that down very lightly just to take the tops off those. So the idea is, so this is the daggerboard, and it now has the 2, well, I don't know what to call these. They're kind of like a lifting fillet stringer. I'm not quite sure how lifting, but what I've done is I've sanded down the edges to make a little finger grip, so it's easy to get your fingers underneath it and pull that up. And the idea is that that's the daggerboard in the boat, and this will go through there. That slides in like that, and then the daggerboard can come out the bottom of the boat. So the bottom of the boat will be here. So this needs to be glassed into the boat and a hole cut in the boat so that the dagger board can go through it. It's worked quite well. And yeah, so at some point I'm going to need to glass that into the boat and then cut a hole to this kind of size in the bottom, and that will go in the forward section. And then this will be glassed. This will be glassed around so that the hole is only on the inside of here and not into the boat. So the glass will seal all that hole up. So the water can only come up into the boat if it comes up out of the top of here. And that's going to be high enough up in the boat that it won't. The water should come up to about there, something like that, the water level. So yeah, this can be glued together. So that's another job I'm hoping to get done today. But first of all, I'm going to try and drill these the new holes for these larger 8mm diameter U-bolts. I previously drilled holes for the 6mm diameter bolts, and then I re-drilled them bigger for this 8mm diameter bolt. And I've now drilled them to be 19mm and then filled them with epoxy, so that when I drill the hole, it'll be through epoxy and there'll be no wood exposed to any moisture, even though it's inside the boat. I don't want any moisture getting into the wood and causing it to rot over time. So that's the first job I want to get done today. Drill out those holes. So it's all really about getting the last jobs done so I can seal up the tanks. And once the tanks are sealed, I can move on to the dagger board. Once the dagger board's done, really then it's just a matter of sheathing the boat underneath with epoxy and then thinking about paint. So let's crack on. So very quickly then, just to show you the holes that I've prepared. So while this was stood on its end, I drilled two 19mm holes here, and I then taped over those holes, and then I stood this on its end and I filled up the holes from the top with epoxy. And the epoxy couldn't get any further down than this because of the tape, and so it's dried completely flush and it's filled up the tanks. It's filled up all the way through the 1.5 inches of reinforcement I've got behind this bulkhead to create a nice epoxy plug that I'm going to drill through to make with an 8mm bit to make the holes for the U-bolts to go in. So that's the next step. I'm going to try and drill these parallel. I'm going to try and drill these parallel so that the U-bolts go straight in. So that's going to be the tricky part. So let's have a go at that. So here I am now prepping for drilling holes. You can see the white, which is the epoxy that's been drilled out. Then getting the hoovering it up. Sorry about the bad angle. So with the second one I've created a better angle for you to see. And you can see I'm using string there to try and create a parallel drill. And you can see also the epoxy that I've just hoovered up. There's a lot of cleaning up in this build. Right, next I'm preparing the aft tanks to have the backfill on the portholes, and I've also decided to do some sanding. So there's the rudder blade. So first of all I'm sanding it smooth around the edges so it makes a nice shape where it's been cut and glued. And then once I've done that, I'm then sort of rounding off the edges. There may still be a bit more to do, to be fair, but at least it's had its first sand down. And then this bit is the filler piece, which goes between the rudder cheeks, and this is where the rudder will sit when it's down, and also it's got a gap for the rudder to go up when you're heading towards the beach. So you can't have the rudder down when you hit the beach. You have to be able to pull it up, so it kind of tilts about 120 degrees from vertical down to about 60 degrees off the vertical. And then now finally mixing a bit of epoxy, because there's a tiny little bit of bit of a hard chine where the boat didn't bend fully properly the first time. Oh, and now finally I'm going to put in the mast collar, which is a big step really. It took quite a lot of time to get that in, longer than I thought it would, because I've got so many other little jobs that it would interfere with if it was done first. Thickening up the epoxy there with some thickener. Pre-coating both surfaces, putting it in place, tidying up. And that's it, all done.